interesting, probably, that those comments were more interesting than my talk is going to be, since it seems that a lot of you already know a lot of what I had planned to say. So I will start just by reacting to some of your comments. First of all, I agree very much with the idea that we need to do a much better job when it comes to provenance of our experimental results. And the ontology for biomedical investigations, I still think is one of the most important contributions of the work that I will be describing in what follows. I won't be talking about it, but I wanted to mention it here. So basically, it's designed to provide a controlled vocabulary which contains terms for all the things which happen in the course of carrying out an investigation, including things like funding applications and material sourcing and many other things. One of our goals actually at the beginning was to persuade equipment manufacturers to incorporate our ontology terms in their catalogs, so that people could find equipment for specific purposes using a controlled vocabulary for search. But none of them could be persuaded. Maybe we'll try again. The other thing I wanted to mention is that we now, and this is quite recent, have a very promising and already quite large food ontology, which covers not just food, but also drink, and also steps over into the realm of agriculture, including genetics as a contribution to plant genetics as a contribution to agriculture. So the food ontology is a nice counterpart to the plant ontology, which is also expanding very nicely as a joint European-American project. Now, HL7 Watch, I did indeed stop it when fire came along. My argument was that several important people in the HL7 world, and I had people in the HL7 world who were communicating with me secretly, told me that I had won, that HL7, insofar as it was so problematic, was disappearing gradually, and that fire would take over, which is, fire is something that I have looked at. I don't want to say anything either positive or negative about it, because I haven't had the time to dig deeply. But that's why HL7 Watch came to an end. And then the issue of expressivity, I will talk about later on. I think this is one of the most important issues relating to the cutting edge of future ontology, because OWL, which is still the de facto standard for ontology, is not expressive enough for many, probably most of the things that we're going to need to say. And then I was interested to hear about the CTP ontologies, and I hope I can get in touch with Esther after this talk to find out more. I also have quite good news about funding. So the University of Buffalo has finally, after 25 years, decided that the work I'm doing in ontology is quite important. And so they have just, they are in the process of hiring at least 2, and perhaps more than 2 ontologists to join in with the efforts that I've been making. And this will go hand in hand with future funding to help spread the necessary messages. So reading the Building Ontologies with Basic Formal Ontology book is all very well, but a lot of people read it and they still make mistakes. And that's because we don't have enough people who are teaching people how to do these things properly. And I'm hoping that this will now, at least in a small way, begin to change. And now, in connection with knowledge graphs, and this is completely new here, I have just finished a book with an AI colleague of mine, who's actually the owner of an AI company in Germany, which is about the limits of AI, including the limits of AI in medicine. So we're all in favor of what we call narrow AI, and that's where my co-author actually makes his money. Narrow AI means AI in a restricted area with a simple system of predictive kinds of events. And an example would be car repair or traffic law. And these are areas with relatively restricted vocabularies and where AI really can succeed in doing work more correctly than human beings and much more quickly than human beings. But when it comes to most of the dreams which AI researchers put forward, such as that there will one day be a machine which is as intelligent or even more intelligent than human beings, we argue that those ideas will never be realized, that there are strict mathematical limits to what machines can do. And so it will appear in August. We are just about to start correcting the final proofs. And it has quite a lot about AI in medicine and something about AI in biology also. All right, so let's dig back in time. The beginning of modern modern ontology, in the sense that ontology can be applied usefully to things like biology and medicine, is in 1998 when the gene ontology was first created on the back of an envelope in a pub in Montreal by a group of people working on human model organisms, flies, mice, and fish, I believe. And the leader of this group was Michael Ashburner. And the gene ontology was born as three ontologies: a biological process ontology, a molecular function ontology, and a cellular component ontology. And the idea is that all genes and all proteins and so forth will be given profiles in terms derived from the gene ontology. So we know where they operate in the cell, we know what the molecular functions of the involved molecules are, and we know what the biological processes are downstream of those molecular functions. And all of these features of a gene or a protein will be described using the same control vocabulary. The gene ontology was a massive success, and it grows, it's more successful from year to year. And there are reasons for this. And one of the reasons is that the gene ontology from the beginning became associated with other ontologies. For instance, ontologies of chemicals, ontologies of diseases, ontology of biomedical investigations, which you've already mentioned, plant ontologies, and so forth, now food ontologies. And so this made the gene ontology successful because it was not an isolated silo, it was linked to other ontologies. And the problem with ontologies in previous decades has been that they were too often built as silos. And the next step occurred in 2004 when the OBO foundry was created. And the idea now was that ontology should not merely be linked to the gene ontology, but they should satisfy certain principles which were satisfied already to a large degree by the gene ontology, but which now would have to be satisfied by any ontology which wanted to be part of what we called the OBO foundry. And we laid down these principles. One of the principles is that BFO has to be the starting point for the building of the ontology, so that the ontology will link from the top level downwards to gene ontology and so forth. And this is the paper where we documented the principles and put forward the first set of OBO foundry ontologies. And the idea of the basic formal ontology arose in the course of many very heated discussions about how the OBO foundry principles should be formulated. And the idea of BFO was that it would take the gene ontology and it would reverse engineer it to create a top level ontology, which means a domain neutral ontology, an ontology which can be applied to any domain. And so what we get is this. So there are processes, including biological processes, which the gene ontology deals with. There are attributes, including molecular functions, which the gene ontology deals with. And there are objects, including cells and cell components and organisms and so forth, which the gene ontology deals with. So this was the birth of BFO. Now, today, BFO looks like this. So it's become somewhat bigger. I do not believe that it's become somewhat more complicated, but I would accept that some of the terminology has become more ugly. And so if we go through, process is still called process. But we also have process boundaries, and we have temporal regions and so forth, which are not processes in the BFO sense. Attributes are now called specifically dependent continuants. And the reason for that is this is how they are defined. And the word attribute is too sloppy. There are too many meanings associated with attribute. And we wanted to have good definitions of the major terms insofar as these were achievable. And then objects are still called objects, but your arm is not an object so long as it's still connected to your body. It's a fiat object part. And the FDA is not an object. It's something like an object aggregate. And then functions are kinds of specifically dependent continuants. More specifically, they're kinds of dispositions, which are kinds of what we call realizable entities, which are kinds of specifically dependent continuants. So BFO 2020 is the fourth version of BFO. There's the steps from one version to the next are always quite small because we have many, many people using BFO. And if we make large changes, then we will create mutinies. So I could describe the changes, but that's not, I think, so important here. So the idea everywhere is that we have hubs and then we have spokes. And sometimes we have spokes which serve as hubs for further spokes at lower levels. And if we all use the same hub, then certainly not all problems will be solved, but some problems will be solved because we will all be using the same starting point. And this idea of creating suites of ontologies called foundries is also gaining traction in a lot of areas. So in 2010, I was approached by the US Army, who knew about the work I'd been doing with the Oboe Foundry, and they wanted me to help them do similar work in connection with intelligence data. It was Afghanistan intelligence data at the time, as I recall. And finally, after 11 years, we are making real progress. So we have high-level backing for the creation of an ontology foundry, both a single ontology foundry, both for the DoD and for the intelligence community, which is a kind of miracle. There are other suites in other areas. So we have the Oboe suite, we have the DoD IC suite, we have the United Nations ontology framework, which, however, is not, as I understand it, being maintained currently. More importantly, we have the Industrial Ontologies Foundry Suite, which is a collection of engineering ontologies and ontologies relating to manufacturing, which is progressing very well. And we will have a public release of the core ontology of IOF sometime in the next weeks. So these are foundries in just the sense in which the Oboe Foundry is a foundry, and they're all based on BFO as their hub. And each of them has a number of constituent ontologies as part. Now, the Army found out that in order to persuade people to support using an ontology-based framework, it would be very useful if the ontology could be created as an international standard. So the Army sponsored BFO to become an international standard, and it was adopted by the Joint Technical Committee of ISO and the International Electrotechnical Commission, because BFO relates both to material things and things which are useful for humans, and to electrotechnical things which are useful in the realm of things like computers. And so this will be a multi-part standard. Two parts have already been released. One is a statement of the requirements for being a top-level ontology, in other words, for being a hub. And the second one is BFO, which demonstrates that the BFO satisfies the requirements for being a top-level ontology. Now, that it was not easy to work out what those requirements should be, and I won't go into any great detail here, but I can do if you're interested. It was an interesting problem. So the one interesting consequence of the fact that BFO is a top-level ontology is that so all the parts so far published are freely available. So you don't have to pay 198 Swiss francs for a PDF file. You can go to this link and find out where you get the content of BFO, which includes all the proofs of consistency and so forth, which we had to produce in order to verify that BFO was worthy of being an ISO standard. But you will also find the original files of the standards documents. And the reason for this is that standards documents, which are used by standards authors to create other standards, are free in ISO. You have to press a button saying that you're going to use or consider using ISO 21838 to build another standard. But if you press that button, you get a free copy of the standard. All right, now, and it's already had something of an impact in that at least one important health informatics standard is based on BFO, and there are other standards which are being built which will be based on BFO. And I don't know how well known the Allotrope Foundation is in the FDA community, but their ontologies are based on BFO also. And Allotrope Foundation is a foundation which is a public effort, but it's funded by the major pharmaceutical companies. So the first thing we had to do was define ontology. And this definition just says that an ontology has both a natural language component and a formal component, so that it can be used both by humans and by machines. Then we define a domain, and then we define a domain ontology, which is an ontology of a domain. Then we define a category, which, and this is the first important definition, it's a class or type that is shared across many different domains and is represented by a domain neutral term. And then we can define a top-level ontology as an ontology that represents categories. So in other words, highly general types of entities, which you find like object and process and function, which you find in many, many domains. That was the goal of the standard, and we think that we've succeeded. And so the requirements for being a top-level ontology, this is the standard part 1, is that you're not allowed to include any domain ontology content, but you have to cover everything in the universe. How you demonstrate that you did that was something of a trick, and I can describe it, as I say, if you're interested. And the second requirement is that you have to include an information artifact, which is textual, which is terms and definitions, and you have to include an OWL axiomatization, and you have to include a common logic axiomatization. Now, I'm assuming that not everyone on this call knows what common logic is. Let me just say that it's also an ISO standard. For people who know something about logic, it's equivalent to standard first order logic, which means that it's much more expressive than OWL. OWL is a very, very small fragment of first order logic, and OWL will only let you express relations which have two terms. So you can't say things like the tumor increased in size over this period of time, because that would be a three-place relation. You can express n-place relations for any n using common logic. Now, the con side of common logic, so that's the pro side, the con side is that common logic is not decidable, which means that you won't get an answer immediately or even ever for certain questions relating to whether given inferences in common logic, for example, are valid. But this is now a relatively trivial problem. So we have tools now which can do much of the work of proving common logic theorems automatically or with a relatively small amount of manual help. But you can also institute timers so that if your reasoning doesn't terminate within, say, 3 seconds or 3 milliseconds or 3 minutes or 3 days, according to your choice, then the machine will switch off after three minutes or seconds. And this turns out to this timer turns out to be useful or needed to be used only in a certain fragment of the relevant cases. Mostly you can make common logic work. And so my prediction is that common logic will be increasingly adopted in the ontology community, but still it's only a small minority of people who are working on this front. And to see why it's useful, consider the infectious disease ontology, which is a BFO ontology, but it's low down in a series of hubs. So IDO is the infectious disease ontology hub, which has a spokes called VIDO, which has another spoke called SIDO, which has then the IDO COVID-19 ontology as one of its spokes. And you can define the term infectious organism using OWL because it's a two-place relation. This term, infectious disposition, you need a 5-place relation. So you can't define infectious disposition in OWL. And to define infection, which you might think is relatively simple, takes an 8-place relation. So this means that the infectious disease ontology and all the ontologies for specific infectious pathogens in specific hosts, so bovine Staph aureus, for instance, most of their content, so the content is really good, but most of that content cannot be used by people who only use OWL. It can be used either for people who use English, or it can be used for people who use common logic. But the bulk of the ontology is still not being used because ontologists use OWL. So this is part 2. We've already seen the ontology. These are older versions. These are the changes between 2.0, which was introduced in 2015, and 2020. I'm not going to talk about that. I will just mention that it's being used. I think I said that already. And this is the industrial ontologies foundry, which I also mentioned. And I think that's probably enough. So I will pause here and